Hi, I'm Brian Grant, and you're listening to On Time, the Brian Grant Foundation podcast about living with Parkinson's. If you want to know more about Brian Grant Foundation, go to briangrant.org.
Hi, this is Katrina Call, Executive Director of the Brian Grant Foundation. Thank you for listening to our podcast, which is one of our many programs to help empower people impacted by Parkinson's disease to lead active and fulfilling lives. Our programs are possible because of the generous support of our donors. Please consider helping us continue this work by making a donation at briangrant.org. Thanks again for listening.
Hello, and welcome to the Brian Grant Foundation podcast On Time, where we explore the critical issues surrounding Parkinson's disease. I'm your host, Larry Gifford, and today we're diving into part 2 of our 4-part series on environmental factors in Parkinson's disease. In our first episode, we set the stage with an overview of how toxins in our environment can play a role in triggering Parkinson's. Today, we are incredibly fortunate to have with us one of the leading experts in this field, Dr. Carly Tanner. Dr. Tanner is one of the world's foremost experts in the interactions of environmental and genetic factors in the pathogenesis of Parkinson's disease and movement disorders. Her work has not only advanced our understanding of these risks, but has also helped shape public policy on these issues. Dr. Tanner, thanks so much for joining us today.
Sure, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Your research has been groundbreaking in helping us understand the role environmental toxins play in Parkinson's. You've been involved in several large-scale studies on Parkinson's and environmental risks. What has been the most eye-opening discovery for you so far?
Well, I guess as far as eye-opening, I guess the real part is the sort of ubiquitousness of some of the exposures that we've identified to be associated with Parkinson's, and the relative inability that any individual might have to know about their personal level of exposure. So just to clarify, for example, we found that in a very well-defined population, Marines who served in Camp Lejeune during a particular period of time, there was a very high concentration of solvents, particularly trichloroethylene and perchloroethylene in the drinking water at Marine Base Camp Lejeune. And that solvent exposure was associated with an increased risk of Parkinson's disease. The catch there is that particular solvent is also commonly found in lots of other drinking water samples around the country, and it's still commonly used as a solvent, a degreaser, in a lot of different settings. And yet most people might not know that they have an exposure. So I guess that's the most sort of impressive piece to me, is that there are a lot of exposures that have been associated with disease risk for Parkinson's or other health outcomes, and yet they continue to be environmentally persistent, and people may have ongoing exposures to them.
Yeah, I imagine it's incredibly difficult for families to realize that something as routine as where they work or where they live could be putting them at a higher risk for Parkinson's. How do families react when they learn that these chemicals that have been so instrumental in the success of their life or their business is making them sick?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a big blow for a lot of people. People can feel kind of dismayed but betrayed, and it can really be very difficult for people to make peace with that kind of understanding.
Yeah. In addition to Marines, you've also studied farmers and industrial workers who face high exposure to these chemicals. What have been some of the key takeaways from those populations?
So one of the key takeaways is that a lot of this is preventable, especially in an occupational setting. Almost paradoxically, it might be easier to prevent high-dose exposure when you're in an occupational setting. So we found, for example, that exposure to certain pesticides, paraquat, 2,4-D, permethrin, can be associated with a higher risk of Parkinson's. Certain organochlorine pesticides may be associated with a higher risk of Parkinson's. This can be at least partially prevented in people who have occupational uses by using personal protective equipment. So we found that people who mixed or applied certain pesticides like paraquat, but also used personal protective equipment. So they used gloves and masks, the appropriate kinds of protective equipment. They washed off if they had a spill and were, had a higher dose exposure. These people didn't have an actual increased risk of Parkinson's. It was the ones who used these chemicals and didn't use or didn't have access to personal protective equipment. So that's a big statement for any occupational setting, that the appropriate precautions can make a big difference for people.
Your studies have been critical in showing the long-term impact of exposure. What are some of the challenges in studying diseases like Parkinson's that may take decades to develop after initial exposure?
Yeah, so it's really, really difficult to look at accurate exposures over decades of use. And in fact, this is one of the ways that industry, for example, or other naysayers have said, oh, this really doesn't have an effect. There really isn't a relationship between exposure and disease, because to get the information, most of the time, we have to use methods that look backwards. So we say, here are people who have disease, and then what are the, comparison population who don't have disease, who are similar in every other way, and then what were their past history of exposures based on occupation. And what we've done is we've taken very careful histories using what we call job task-based occupational histories. So we don't ask people, were you exposed to pesticides? We say, what did you do? What was your job? What were your specific tasks? How much time did you spend doing any one of those tasks? And then we detail that over all the years of someone's work life. Then we work with experts who understand those industries and those occupations, who say, oh, that means that person likely was exposed to, this pesticide or this solvent based on what the industrial practices are that we know. So it's a very detailed way of collecting that history, but also very time intensive. And it presents a lot of challenges in terms of being able to move forward and do this work. I'll also say that for people who aren't in an occupation, so you or me, if we're just, spraying pesticides around our home, using them in the garden, using solvents in a hobby or something like that, it's very hard to collect that information, right?
Yeah, for sure. And it's been made difficult in the United States to regulate these toxins. Are there any success stories for regulations or interventions that successfully reduced Parkinson's risk in a specific community?
I guess I'm not the right person to answer.
Can't think of any.
Yeah.
The connection between occupational and environmental exposure to chemicals and Parkinson's is concerning. Are there particular steps that people can take to protect themselves, especially those who live in areas where the chemicals might be present?
Yeah. So I think that, what I've just mentioned, personal protective equipment, the fact that, if you are exposed, but you're careful to either wash off, if you're in a place where, let's say, pesticides are sprayed, for example, being mindful of personal hygiene, possibly if there's active spraying, wearing a mask. We're getting better at wearing masks now since COVID, but using masks to protect against other kinds of exposure as well. Being thoughtful if you're outside or you're touching things or picking vegetables or doing things like that, to wash off, but also being mindful about what you eat and careful washing and peeling of fruits or vegetables, or using organic products if you can. There's an economic issue for organic products because they're more expensive. It's harder for people to afford them, but being mindful and in implementing as much as you can those kinds of ways to protect yourself would be important.
What are some of the most promising areas of your research that you see emerging in connection between environmental factors and Parkinson's?
Promising areas. That's an interesting question. I think we're moving forward in trying to understand the mechanisms of the causes of these, and also to sort of move backwards and recognizing people at an earlier stage before Parkinson's is fully manifest. And then that couples with another whole area of research, which is ways to prevent the development or the progression of disease. So if we can identify people earlier, for example, people who have loss of sense of smell, or people who have a behavior is called dream enactment behavior, some of those people, not all of them, might be moving in the direction of developing Parkinson's. Those are people we can counsel. Physical activity, for example, is very important in terms of slowing disease progression, and may be very important to implement in all those people, even if none of them are, necessarily going to get Parkinson's. Physical activity may be a good preventive intervention to prevent the possibility that they might get Parkinson's. So giving them health advice early on, I think, is an important thing. There are a lot of therapeutics that people are investigating that are being developed that may turn out to slow disease progression. Nothing is a home run yet. But if that happens, identifying people in this at-risk category, either because they're pesticide applicators, and then you might want to screen them to see if they have loss of sense of smell. And if they have some early features like that, there are ways we can start doing biomarker testing for some of the proteins that are associated with Parkinson's risk. And those might be a prime candidate for interventions to then slow or even prevent the onset of disease. So that's kind of what we're hoping for, that we can do some focused screening and ultimately prevent the onset of disease.
Yeah, I mean, I saw on the website, your website, that for the first time, you really feel like there's an opportunity here to prevent or at least somehow get Parkinson's to a point where it doesn't have to fully onset.
That's right. That's right. I mean, if you stop at loss of sense of smell, it's not great, but you can live with it, right? Much better than progressing on to having motor problems and balance problems and other factors associated with Parkinson's. So that's what we're hoping for. And I think we can target risk groups. There are some people who have family histories or genes that put them at risk. That's a small population, but also people who have these environmental exposures that might put them at risk, and to really focus screening on these populations and maybe really be able to intervene and prevent disease.
Yeah, I think that's key. Dr. Tanner, it's been absolutely enlightening to hear about your work and the critical links between toxic chemicals and Parkinson's. It's a topic that affects so many people, and I know our listeners find your insights incredibly valuable. But before we close, what would you say to someone who's just learning about these risks for the first time? What's the key takeaway you'd like them to have?
I think the key takeaway is to think about prevention almost at any point that you are, even if you're someone who has Parkinson's disease already and you've been diagnosed and you look back and you say, oh, gee, I was exposed. First of all, you can stop being exposed as much as you can now. So we've had people, go out into their garage and say, oh my gosh, look at the solvent. I've been using it every day. Look at what you're doing. Be thoughtful about what you're eating. Increase your physical activity. Use personal protective equipment as much as you can. And I think those things are all really important, no matter at what point you are in disease.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kinel, for joining us today and sharing your expertise. It's clear that while the challenges we face regarding environmental toxins and Parkinson's are significant, your research offers both clarity and hope for the future. So thank you.
Thank you.
Now we bring in Dan Kinel. He's a retired attorney from Rochester, New York. In a 2024 report in the Journal of Movement Disorders, there's this case of a large dry cleaner operation in Rochester from 1950 to 1994. In 1992, an environmental assessment found that the surrounding soil was contaminated with TCE, PCE, and other chemicals. 300 feet across the street is an 18-floor retail and office tower with a 3-level underground parking garage towards which the groundwater flows. On the 7th floor was Dan Kinel. Dan, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So can you share a little bit of your personal journey with Parkinson's and how you became to suspect TCE was the possible cause?
Sure. I was diagnosed in 2013, developed a little tremor in my pinky finger, which I thought was nothing, and I ignored it for a little while. And then I went to see a neurologist at the advice of my primary care physician, who said, I'd be a little more concerned if I were you. And I was diagnosed and got a second opinion on the spot in the University of Rochester's mood disorder clinic. And then that sent me into a pretty bad depression because I was worried my life was over, and that there's nothing else to look forward to. And after I snapped out of that, I got involved in research. And one of the things I got involved with was something called the Udall Center for Parkinson's Research that was at the U of R. That was led by Dr. Ray Dorsey. And one day after a meeting of the executive committee that I was on of the Udall Center, Ray turned to me and said, Dan, why do you think you got Parkinson's? And I said, I'm not really sure, but there's always been a rumor going around that the building that we're in, my law firm, was making people sick. And that led us to kind of dream up and collaborate on this project and learn about contamination and figure out that there might be a connection between TCE and Parkinson's and in and among the people I work with.
What was your initial reaction upon learning about the potential link between TCE and PD?
I wasn't surprised that there has to be some cause. Idiopathic is not a cause, and my diagnosis was idiopathic. There was no, but I was surprised. Frankly, I was shocked that of the level of contamination in the building across the street. There was a dry cleaner there between 1950 and 1994 about. And for, I think, probably that whole 50 years, they just literally poured used TCE into a pit in their basement, right into the ground. And when they're building the building that's there now, when they remediated the site, I think they remediated the site. But when they tried to remediate the site, they moved thousands of tons of contaminated soil. There were staining pools of TCE. The news articles at the time, which I subsequently looked at, we have pictures of the dry well or pit in the basement. The news articles at the time said the contamination was so bad that workers putting together the foundation of the building, when they finally put a building up on the site, had to wear hazmat suits. They could only work for 15 minutes at a time. And the most shocking part about it to me is that at the end of the day, there's a plume. There's a known plume, and they only followed the plume to the end of the property line. They never went beyond the property line to see what would happen to the plume. Now, this was in the days when TCE contamination wasn't really a well-known cause of Parkinson's, but it was a well-known carcinogenic. And just if this plume went toward Midtown Tower, which is the office building that I worked in from the site, I think the study says 300 feet away, but the parking garage literally is probably 50 feet from the building where the contamination was. The parking garage for the building I was in, where I parked my car, went down 3 levels right to the bedrock. And the theory that we have no way of knowing for sure, because this was 35 years ago, 30 years ago, 25 years ago, is that the TCE flowed towards the building from the contaminated site, entered the parking garage, where elevators in Midtown Tower went from the 15th floor to the lowest level of the parking garage, going up and down, and they acting like pistons, pulling this toxic chemical that's odorless and colorless into the building.
Given your legal background, what fantasies did you have in your head regarding legal pursuits after finding out this?
So, I to be perfectly honest, I was a corporate lawyer, so I've never been to court. Literally, I know where the courthouse is because I was invited to a judge to have lunch with them once. That's the only reason I know where the courthouse is in Rochester. I wasn't interested in legal pursuits, pursuing legally. I was interested in figuring out the cause. My goal has been, and still is, not to get paid for my sickness, but to make sure my kids and grandchildren don't get sick.
Yeah, I would think that would be very concerning if you, as a father, to know that you probably brought your kids to your office from time to time.
Well, I think that sure, they were in the office. They were. I was there when for the 7 years I was there. I was there 7 days a week, sometimes 12 hours a day, working late nights when the HVAC was not on. And then, so they weren't there that long, but I don't, I was in an office building. I was wearing a shirt and tie. I wasn't working in vats of chemicals and dipping parts in chemicals. I wasn't expecting to get sick from environmental caused pollution. And so when I say my kids and grandkids, I mean, I don't want them to have to worry about where they're working, living, or playing being safe. I mean, they have, we should value life enough that we don't let people get sick like that. We as a society.
Yes. What are the challenges that researchers face when trying to establish a definitive link between TCE exposure and PD?
So the biggest challenge is causation. We know TCE is a carcinogen. We know it causes Parkinson's, but the challenge is that somebody's exposed, like myself, doesn't get diagnosed until years later, and there could have been intervening causations, and it's hard to know whether that was the cause definitively. And now I think we probably can guess it certainly played a role, but how big role we don't know. And then that leads into dosage. How much do you have to be exposed to cause illness? And why do some people get sick when some people don't? Because, if it made everybody sick and it was there, everybody in the office would have cancer or Parkinson's. Now, that being said, in the study, we looked at we looked at 81 partners, and 79 participated in some way, shape, or form, either through filling out a questionnaire, clinic visits, or in the case of some who are deceased, having their relatives fill out questionnaires or provide medical records, or looking at the National Death Index or other publicly available sources of information. Of the people who passed away, about 75% of them died of a TCE-related illness. It's an illness that is caused or related to TCE exposure, which is a huge percentage. Part of the problem we have with the study is that, problem, so to speak, is that a lot of us are still alive. And, I have Parkinson's. That doesn't preclude me from getting cancer. It doesn't preclude me from getting some other illness. And we're only going to know about this until 10, 20, 30 years from now, when everybody passes away. We can say, how did all these people die? What did they die of? And how did illness impact their lives? So that brings home the challenge of, how do you prove causation when the time between causation and illness is great, and there's other potential causes? Now, that being said, we know enough about TCE and TCE illness to know that nobody should be exposed to it. It's we don't need to know that. You don't need to know that you're 100% likely to die before you stop taking actions that cause your death. That wouldn't make any sense. Just to know that substantial likelihood this is a bad thing for you to do, and so we should not have people do it. We shouldn't have these polluted sites. In Monroe County, which is the county where I live in New York State, there are 155 Class 2 TCE sites, 15 of which about are within a half a mile or quarter mile of a daycare. And most of these sites are not fully remediated. It's not just Monroe County, it's everywhere. In Washington State, they're doing a statewide project to figure out how close all these sites, every dry cleaner, TCE is widely used as dry cleaner. How close you daycares are to dry cleaners, in order to look at childhood leukemia. It's crazily ubiquitous and insanely dangerous. And the fact that we're not devoting resources as a society to cleaning this stuff up is just mind-boggling to me, except for the fact that when you think about the time between exposure and disease is so long, people think that, well, it's not going to happen to me. Well, it did.
Well, it's interesting because if you work on a farm or if you work in a chemical plant, they're going to give you personal protective equipment, PPE, but there's no PPE for a law firm.
Right. In fact, wearing dry, maybe that, lawyers have higher instances of PD than others, and it could be for lots of reasons. It could be some predisposition to, thinking or doing, but it also could be the fact that lawyers traditionally weren't a lot of clothes that require dry cleaning.
Yeah.
And that clothes retains TCE vapor, and that may, if you're wearing clothes on your body that has TCE in it all day long, that may contribute to illness. But you don't expect that when you're working in a suit and tie in a fancy office building on the 7th floor, like I did, that you're going to be potentially exposed to something like TCE vapor that's coming in through the groundwater. It's just not something that ever would have crossed my mind. And it enters the building. Think of like radon. Many people, I think most states have radon testing requirements, and a lot of homes, especially around here, have radon in their home. So you test for radon when you buy a home, and you put in a remediation system. And it enters the air much like TCE. It comes from underground, it enters cracks in the foundation, and it kind of goes up into the air where it's odorless and colorless, and you breathe it in, and it causes illness. And the solution is exactly the same as a radar mitigation system. It's a vapor intrusion barrier. It's a reverse action pump that pumps air from under the slab out to the outdoors to keep the air from coming into your home, work, or place of entertainment. So we can clean up these sites. We can mitigate the impact for sites that have already where the plume is already developed to protect people who live there. We can ban further use of TCE. So it's all doable. Just having well, and part of the problem as somebody with PD is that we're not it's hard to feel sorry for a lawyer who worked in an office building wearing a suit and tie who got sick in his 40s. It's just not as sympathetic as children getting cancer, and it's not playing the disease Olympics here, but it's just less sympathetic. The public doesn't grasp onto that as I'm a balding 50-year-old. Nobody's always going to put a poster on me and say, "Feel sorry for this guy."
Well, I feel sorry for you.
For the balding, I assume.
Yeah, that's what I meant. I've got a nice coif of hair. So if somebody suspects that their office building may be exposed to chemicals or their health condition may be related to their office building, what recommendations do you have for them?
Well, it's the first question is, how do you know? I mean, how do you suspect? For me, it was just sort of like a random conversation with the physician who happens to study Parkinson's disease and TCE exposure that led us to kind of figure out that the building next door was heavily contaminated. The groundwork from the building next door was heavily contaminated. I think we need tools that allow people to type in an address and say, how close am I to a site that's contaminated? Or how close would I be? Do I want to send my kids to a site that's close? Type in their daycare provider or their prospective new house or where they want to spend their next vacation and say, how close is this to a potential contaminated site? And then if somebody develops a disease, then certainly go to the specialist. But to screen for TCE is harder to do. Insurance companies may not want to pay for it because it's just a general cancer screen. But if I thought that I had, and I do go for regular cancer screen now, if I thought that I had that I was next to a site that was contaminated, and I lived or played next to that site for any period of time more than passing, I would get a yearly cancer screen by somebody who's familiar with TCE related cancers, who's familiar with PD, and familiar with the impact that environmental exposure could have on their health. But figuring that out is hard.
And this is just one chemical of a number of chemicals that can cause health issues. And oh boy!
Yeah. But this is a chemical it is so widely. Yeah, every dry cleaner used it. Every auto shop used it. It's a great degreaser, just like asbestos is a great insulator. There's no better insulator than asbestos. There's only one small problem: it causes mesothelioma. And the difference is that when you get mesothelioma, it was because of asbestos. So when you get Parkinson's, it could be just, a small percentage you get it because, as you said, genetics. Some people get it from exposure to chemicals, and there may be other reasons too that we don't know about. So it's not the connection isn't ironclad, but it's substantial enough that we can do something about this. And since every dry cleaner uses it, it's when you look at a map of potential TCE sites, it's like it's like a kind of, you look at a map of the world at night that shows where cities are lit up in the nighttime. It looks exactly the same. Any place where there's a city, any place where it's industrialization, any place where there's a factory, any place where there's a dry cleaner. In the town that I live in, on the main street in a nice little bucolic suburb of Rochester, New York, there's 2 dry cleaners, one of which is closed and one of which is not, both of which are Superfund sites, both of which have plumes behind them. And I'm guessing both of which the neighbors have no idea that they are living next to or on top of, in some cases, toxic plumes. And that's just an example. Those sites are everywhere. As
an advocate now, what are you doing, and what can other people do to help bring it into TCE?
It's a good question. And I think there's no easy answer, but I think as an advocate, generally, we have to be sure that our state, local, and national elected representatives are aware of the problem, are aware that we want something done about the problem, are aware that we want to live in a safe place, environmentally safe place, that we don't want to get sick from exposure, to our kids or family. I think that anybody who lives next to a dry cleaner should go onto their state Department of Environmental Conservation or similar website, see if they can find anything about that site. And I think we need to demand that these sites, and there's thousands of them, so it's not going to be easy or cheap. That's part of the problem, but we need to do it. There are thousands and thousands of them in the U.S. alone that need to be cleaned up, and then there's thousands of buildings that need to be protected through a remediation system. So it's not inexpensive, but I think the cost of the PD and the cost of the cancer is immeasurably higher than the cost of cleaning things up.
Dan Kinel, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And to our listeners, thank you for tuning into this episode of the Brian Grant Foundation podcast On Time. Remember, this is just part 2 of 4 of the series on environmental factors of Parkinson's disease, so be sure to join us next time as we continue exploring the critical issues surrounding this important topic. In the meantime, stay informed, stay engaged, and together we can make a difference in closing chapters of the story of Parkinson's disease.
The Brian Grant Foundation empowers people impacted by Parkinson's to lead active and fulfilling lives. Help support our efforts at briangrant.org. A special thank you to Raphael Sadiq for providing the music for this podcast. This podcast is produced by Brian Griggs. Learn more at griggsproductions.com.